Welcome back, everyone. Our next session is Closing the Security Void Left by PAM and IGA in the Cloud. Presenting this session, we have Simon, the Director of Global Cybersecurity and Global Digital Identity Lead for the CIO at Accenture, Johan, a Security Consulting Senior Manager at Accenture, and from Sonrai Security, we have Sandy Bird, who's our CTO and co-founder. Over to you, presenters.
Karen, thanks for the intro. And just to remind everyone listening in today, if you have questions, just drop them in the chat and we will get to those at the end of the session. And welcome to this great session. Look, I'm joined by two great people today. Johan Lund is here. Johan spends a huge amount of time with Accenture's customers on identity on that side. And Simon, great to have you. Simon Gooch, the Director of Cyber. And you have global identity, I believe, as well for the CIO's office. So again, welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us. You can do a little intro in a minute. I probably screwed your titles up, but we'll let you correct them. This session's all about kind of the void and how things change with PAM and IGA and just-in-time provisioning and all these things as you move from an enterprise that probably has pretty mature identity processes into using public cloud. Maybe for the first time, maybe you've been doing it for 5 years, maybe you're doing great, maybe you're doing terrible. We'll figure that out as we go. But then also, like, once you have this stuff up and running, if you have great governance in the cloud, like, where do you go next and things of that nature. So look, Johan, Simon, I'm going to turn it over to you for just a minute. Introduce yourselves, a little bit about your roles, and then we'll kind of take a look at, maybe a little bit about architectures and things like that after. So yeah, Simon, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks, Andy. Yeah, great to be here. And I think the easiest way to describe my role is, I'm responsible for securing all the core technology that runs the Accenture business. I could leave it there. That might not really tell you what that's all about, but whether it's how we think about securing that kind of core network, whether it's how we think about securing SaaS platforms from a configuration management perspective, securing all our workstations, those are all part of my responsibility. I have to make sure we're doing the right thing and it's aligned to our security strategy, but also our global tech strategy. And then, as you mentioned, Sandy, I also have direct accountability for all of the identity services, whether that's CIM, MFA, the whole IGA scope of services and activities. That's all mine as well. I have an interesting view, I think, of this space generally, because a lot of the things we're going to talk about I've had to experience and it's had quite a big impact on me over the last couple of years. But honestly as well, it's probably worth mentioning, and then I will let Johan kind of chime in. I don't actually come from a security background either. I've only been doing security for 5 or 6 years. I come from an IT transformation background. So I actually find a lot of the things that are happening in this space super interesting in the context of that bigger move to the cloud and how you think about what you want to do, not just from a tech perspective, but honestly, like, why are we doing this? What's the business value?
Look, I love it. I think this whole, again, mixed history and different roles in your past actually work really well for this. I also think, just don't learn from our mistakes of the past is a good thing to have in the back of your head too. Johan, give us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having us join. I appreciate being here. So I'm similar to Simon. I'm working in the IAM space right now, but I do it with Accenture Security. It's in the identity and access management space. And right now I'm helping clients in, with that type of work, whether it be implementations or supporting some kind of operation. My background, though, is I have worked in the industry for quite a long time. I've worked in information security for quite a long time in a variety of different roles. And then right now, in particular, I have this opportunity where I got to partner with Simon and to integrate a KIM solution within Accenture CIO. And that's where Simon and I have partnered and kind of worked together.
Great. It's probably good to talk a bit about this scale, the types of cloud properties you're in, those types of things. You obviously can't give any secrets away, Simon, about the complete internal inner workings of this all, but give the audience just a little bit of scale and size kind of concept and which clouds are important to you, maybe.
Yeah, the top line numbers. Accenture's fast approaching being an 800,000 person organization. We are truly multi-cloud, so we're across all the big cloud providers. And we have I think we have a pretty good strategy in terms of just from a tech enablement perspective. We decided kind of 10 years ago that, we knew the cloud was the only place that at our size of business, 800,000 people, with, I don't know what the number is now, but probably 3,000 plus clients, we knew we really needed a lot of the flexibility that the cloud provided. So we started that journey, I think, not necessarily ahead of everyone, but I think ahead of the bow wave that you've been seeing over the last 2 or 3 years. But we didn't just stop at that kind of initial cloud journey. We very much have an architectural intent to be cloud native. And honestly, I think we're at 35% of all of our critical services are now kind of SaaS service, or, and truly kind of, cloud native. So it definitely impacts our thinking. It makes us really, I think, reflect on, how much we want to avoid legacy approaches to stuff, how much we really want to understand how we can extract absolutely every piece of value from that flexibility that we get when we think about cloud services. But over the last 10 years, because we've been doing this for quite a long time, and we'll talk about it in a bit, I think, Sandy, as well, but I've experienced a lot. I've been through a lot in terms of the things that were good that you can do more broadly in terms of that tech journey. But honestly, like the things that I really wish that I know today, and I think that's one of the strengths that Johan has when he talks to some of our clients. Like, we just have learned so much stuff that you don't need to relearn. I really wish that I could have leapfrog some of the things that I've had to experience in the last couple of years, because Accenture, as an organization of its size and scale, with its complexity, it's been an interesting journey, I think, to get to here.
Very neat. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Cloud Security Alliance conference, and they spent a huge amount of time talking about, learning from your mistakes and complexity in these systems, but yet could be a better world actually if done properly. And I think that's, it resonates here as well. Johan, clearly you spend time with customers, pain points from them that you think are worth bringing up, humans versus non-human identities and things like that, or machine identities in cloud. What are you seeing in the field?
So I think this is an interesting topic, or a good question here. And it kind of varies. I mean, it really depends on who you're talking with, as far as clients are concerned. So one of the things that I've noticed is when I talk to a typical identity access management group, oftentimes we're looking, we're focused on users' identities and service accounts in particular, and that's like the typical traditional thing to look at. And I think it is, some of my conversations with some of our clients, especially with the IAM groups, we start talking a little bit about machine identities. And I think some of them think machine identities, they immediately jump to service account. I remember when I first got on this thing, I thought the same thing too. But it's more than that. And you realize really quickly in the cloud, like, wait a second, these compute resources, these resources in the cloud can become identities. It's not just a service account in the sense that, traditionally the way you thought about it. And so just having those conversations with clients it's been really good. And hopefully it's been very enlightening too, as we've had those conversations with them.
You see, again, expanding a bit on that, service accounts, and again, we have this multi-cloud problem. So we have, roles in AWS, which, instance profiles use, and then we have, in Azure, we've got under the covers something called a service principal that then has, enterprise apps, and, there's lots of different managed identities, there's all these things. And then in GCP, you have something that's actually truly called a service account. Do you think in the field, do people understand the benefits some of these brings? Again, short-lived tokens and stuff obviously is a huge benefit of this, right? We're not carrying keys around and putting them in config files anymore, which is good. But then some of the complexities that come in the way the entitlements work, and do people understand it when you talk to them, or is there a lot of education you're still doing?
Again, it depends on the group. So if you talk to a cloud group, yeah, they get it. They get it really quickly, especially cloud security groups in particular. But when you do have conversations with IAM groups, typical traditional IAM groups that don't have that visibility in the cloud, where the organization, for whatever reason, has that separation where, there's a bunch of IT guys working in the cloud, and then you have your InfoSec guys in the IAM space. Some of the guys in the IAM space they don't have that understanding, and you're having to spend a little bit of time doing some education on that. And that's what I've seen in just some of the conversations that I've had. And they're not all like that, but it just depends on how mature they are in the cloud and where they're at. But often there is a lot of folks that I've had conversations with that have spent a lot of time in IAM that don't understand that right now.
And I think, and I think, Sandy, it present for me, it's such a great question because it presents part of a challenge and part of opportunity for me. So that, the challenge, Johan, I think, outlined in terms of just, do you have the right mindset? Do you have the right skills? Do you understand technically what you're trying to enable? And I think the way that I think we pivoted to think about that in Accenture when we were looking at, Kim and what we needed to do and some of the complexity of those cloud environments was actually say, well, we probably don't have all the right skills. And in fact, are we thinking about this from a kind of classic securing, maybe kind of non-cloud legacy perspective, and really use it? So actually use the problem that was in front of us and the challenge to try and re-educate ourselves and actually challenge our thinking around just, honestly, even more broadly than just this space, our security services, and do I think a couple of fundamental things. So one was ask ourselves, I think you raised it, Sandy. I mean, are we, it's not an organizational question, but are we thinking about this in terms of not really kind of pure infrastructure or security, but do we really understand the problem we're trying to solve for here and what it means to the business? And that's not, a kind of mindless time to value statement or whatever else. It's just saying, hey, this isn't really just infrastructure anymore. This is much more complicated than that. Do we have the right, honestly, do we have the right architectural understanding and intent? So we use that to drive, I think, a bit of a challenge ourselves in our thinking. And then we also used it to say, well, I think, we will definitely touch on this. How do we think about the effectiveness of what we're trying to do? Like what is the outcome? And you can't think about the outcome if you're going to think about it from a legacy mindset perspective. So we have to make that change first. But once we've done that and, thought about the space and what we were truly trying to enable, then we started to think about those things. So I think it's driven us to really actually challenge the way that we've thought about identity and to some degree the broader security space. And that's been super interesting for me because we no longer think about security as something we want to do to the rest of the firm. And again, I think trying to secure the kind of Kim space has driven us to say, well, how are we leading the firm's charge to do some of this stuff? So security now, for me, this is a great space and I think a great opportunity to work in a space that is pivotal to a lot of organizations, bigger tech strategy and enablement strategy, that kind of cloud consumption space, but put this right at the top of that and say, I'm going to do this thing first and I'm going to think about it in the context of it as a cloud service in its own right. So as I can actually feel and tell the story for all those other tech groups and what they're trying to do, as well as the stuff I need to do for them and to them. So maybe that's a little bit philosophical, but we've kind of we've brought all of that stuff to bear in our thinking in this space.
So I now have 40 directions we can go. But I actually, you drove this really interesting concept there. And again, you and Johan can figure out how to divide this up as I ask it. But so you talked a lot about, we're going to put this at the top. It's going to be kind of this interesting priority. But then you talked about teams and things. I'm like, so how does this organizationally happen in the cloud? And I always sometimes love to think about it this way. When we did classic identity stuff, you had a group and there was a manager of a group and they approved things or attested to them or whatever. But who in the heck approves the serverless function role, right? How does that work? And then I've heard, and again, it's kind of an interesting perspective because you get it from different areas. Some customers are like, that's just development. They own them. That's their responsibility. They have to do it. And then you have some really strong identity teams that are like, no, they need to be at least privileged because when we get attacked, it won't be a human identity. They'll get in somehow, a vulnerability, something, and then they'll use that identity to laterally move and, get position in the cloud. how do you guys see this organizationally, and who has the power and who turns the switches for this stuff?
That's a tough enough question. I'm going to let Johan answer it first.
That is a tough question, Sandy. I think it's interesting to hear you talk about that. I think every organization is going to operate differently in that sense. And I think and I've seen this where the InfoSec organization, especially the IAM organization, may be different than the cloud organization, and you're right. So cloud is off doing their own thing at some point. I kind of.
Well, let me jump in there because honestly, my perspective is one of the things I think you need to personally, you do need to move. It's one of the things we did. We moved identity. Identity moved out of the kind of classic security InfoSec space, and we moved it into technology because actually a lot of Sandy, a lot of your questions are like, how do you want to effectively deliver some of the outcomes of being secure, but also just how you're going to run all of that infrastructure that you're looking to interface with. And for me, honestly, part of it was getting much closer to those kind of areas of technology, not necessarily devolving all responsibility and accountability. So I kind of get that point you made about needing to make sure you can enforce patterns for least privilege, etc. But I think you can be more effective in that if you're much closer to the tech. So actually, for me, part of what we did was, I now sit in the technology kind of enablement piece of our organization. Sorry, Johan, to jump in, but
no, that's a good response. What I was gonna say is it reminds me of the early 2000s when we did vulnerability management. If you're back then, I remember like InfoSec didn't, it's like IT standing up servers quickly and trying to do some patching, but they weren't really the best at it until InfoSec they got like Qualys scanning or something like that. And then they started to do the scans themselves and then started to hold IT accountable. It kind of reminds me a little bit like that, where it's kind of like cloud's going to be doing their own thing. They're going to be doing, the developers are going to do whatever, but until you've got some kind of tool to kind of hold them accountable to say, hey, let me get the power back in information security to say, hey, we know that these machine identities are being stood up like left and right, and they're not least privileged, and here's the reasons why, and here's all the things that we can see. Until you get that kind of visibility, you can't really get that control. And so I think for like an InfoSec department or organization, it can be really difficult in working with these different areas. I think the key really, I think what it boils down to is the leadership. As long as the leadership can get in some kind of alignment, that's really what's going to be key as far as like resolving those kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, I always like to talk about you've got to have the zones that the developers can stretch their mental capacity, and you need to be able to give them a lot of rope to create things and build things with probably some pretty sensitive identities and permissions and things to do that. But then there's certainly areas, I'm sure, in your cloud where the critical things are sitting, the crown jewels, if you want to call it that, and that needs to be locked down in a way more secure state, and you need to have a lot more control about what people are doing there, and lots more checking before it goes to production in those cases. We had on our list of things we were going to chat about today, we had this kind of like what's the difference between PAM and IGA, secret stores, vaulting, all of these types of things in cloud versus on-prem? Like, how is it different? Are there things that people should consider? Does Kim fill this gap? Does actually, using the secrets managers in the cloud versus external ones, how does all that stuff play into your mind?
Ken, that sounds like a tough question. I'm going to let Johan answer it first.
I'll start it, and then Simon will help me finish it. That's okay. What will happen here. Okay. So, I think when I think about IGA, I typically think of like, roles and access management to some degree, but specifically I think about periodic reviews where there's some kind of governance capability where you're looking at that access, whatever it is. And then when I think about PAM, oftentimes I think about privileged access management and how you have like an account that's, in a vault of some kind, and there's some kind of session monitoring on that account when somebody accesses it. I think cloud is unique and in this space, in the sense that like a machine identity doesn't really fit in the same sense of the traditional IGA or traditional PAM view. You can't vault a machine identity, and you can't definitely like put some kind of session monitoring in place when it's going to, when it's being deployed to do whatever automation. And so I think it's definitely unique. It's different. And I think that's where the challenge comes in, where you've got to you have to, and Simon's kind of talked about this a little bit, but like, you got to look at it differently than you've looked at the other legacy solutions that you've looked at before. It just does not work the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with Johan, but I think the thing that has a potential to trip you up is it is different, but it is also an evolution and an extension of those things, and you can't ignore them. And in fact, there's a whole load of principles in them that you're looking to apply, but it's how you apply them. The mechanism for getting some of the outcomes that you still would like to achieve with some of that classic PAM and IGA stuff is just different. The context is different. And I think that's where organizations struggle sometimes I hope that was the point I was trying to make earlier on. Actually, the context is the difficult bit. The learning that new ecosystem and what you're trying to achieve in terms of some of those similar principles, like the way you do it, some of the considerations which you're talking about, Johan, they're fundamentally different, and you do need to change your mindset in terms of how you go about achieving some of those outcomes. But also, honestly, and I think this is one of the biggest struggles, how you don't let this space become something that's kind of isolated and orphaned from all the other things we've just spoken about. Because fundamentally, actually, a load of, let's call it classic IGA and classic PAM, they're still overlays that are still relevant. They are actually sitting within that stack and within the considerations we've got. And we need to think about, well, what does that mean when we think about them top to bottom? I mean, one of the challenges I have, and I think it's a difficult thing to answer, someone will say, yeah, but Simon, it's all just, whether it's machine or non-human or cloud or non-cloud, it's all just identity. Can't you just explain it to me very simplistically? And honestly, like, one of the reasons I think we struggle in this space is because we perhaps talk about it in isolation. So I do think being able to talk about it, which is why your question's interesting, Sandy, in the context of all those things, even if it has different principles and different intents, is interesting.
It probably is the principles and intents that we need to cover, right? It's like, as Johan said, like, we actually don't need to vault the machine identity anymore because it's already using these kind of short-lived access tokens. But the whole point of that PAM system before was that session monitoring, maybe. Okay, well, you have all the right audit turned on in the cloud so that you have proper session monitoring of the machine identity, or did you forget to turn on the audit, right? So again, it is this kind of context of making sure we achieve the same goals. The tools might be different, but the goals get achieved. And that's what's important, I think, in that side of it. So no, very, very interesting stuff on that side. Look, we're getting, as time moves on here, and someone will give us the hook as we go through this thing. I did want to talk a little bit about, access to data, access to sensitive data. And I'll kind of open this because I love this scenario of defense in depth, right? In enterprises, we always had defense in depth, and we would have said that, we have all these different things. But in reality, we have a tendency to build a lot of firewall rings, just deeper and deeper and deeper. And when we actually do this in cloud, I find defense in depth is actually, we have an identity control, we have a network control, we probably have an encryption control with a separate set of, who can access the encryption keys for the data. And that gives us that defense in depth. How do you guys see like identity and data access coming together, going apart in this stuff as well? What's your take there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the data bit of it, I think, is very early in kind of people's, I think, thinking, architectural intent, and implementation of, honestly, kind of, the frameworks of control. Because classically, people have thought about data in some fairly kind of basic terms in terms of, data loss prevention. And, when I talk to people about how do you categorize your data, they might flip to their kind of 4 organizational classifications of data, whatever they might be. And when you really start to look at how you consume kind of cloud native services and how you need to kind of really think about, I think, what the cloud brings to the management of data, all of that stuff is at best table stakes. It doesn't really help you. It is sitting on the edge. And you really need to start to say, well, from a data perspective, before I even talk about what role identity plays, do I understand what data I've got? And I mean, data attributes, and do I understand how that data flows between different systems and within different cloud providers? Do I actually truly have line of sight to all my data, and not in a classic sense either? So not necessarily through the application that I built or the service that I'm consuming, because those are just one method of understanding a view on data. Do I understand data as it flows through all of my APIs? Leads you into an interesting question about how well you're securing your APIs then in the construct of data. And then all of that unstructured data use, which isn't a classic application kind of interface, right? Before you then start to look at modern kind of data products and services, the concept of which is just about to be accelerated exponentially when you talk about it in terms of Gen AI, because all that is really data and data context surfaced for fundamentally new business uses at a speed and level of, I think, kind of depth of kind of data analysis that we've not had before. So all of those things drive us to need to really redefine how we think about data. I don't know that there's a great answer for that yet, apart from you have to start those building blocks and start to build that picture up. And that's a challenge, because there's a lot to do in that space, I think, for any organization. And then for me, I tie that complexity and all those things we need to think about to, well, what role does identity play? And you kind of started this conversation out, Sandy, with talking about it in defense in depth. And to some degree, from a principle perspective, I think we're flattening defense in depth a little bit, because I'm moving to think about it in terms of only data, although I think probably just giving you 10 different ways to think about and catalog and categorize data. So I'm adding the I think the depth bit actually within that one layer. And then I think about identity and all of the constructs that come along with it in terms of, what we need identity to drive, whether it's understanding things like, conditional access and managed devices, whether it's understanding, just, threats and risks around different identity types and identity usages. So I actually think to one degree, we are pivoting to a world where it is only data and identity, basically, but we're building many, many different layers into those two constructs. And I think that's quite a challenge for us at the moment, and it's quite a transformation in our thinking.
Look, we are, again, we're not going to get to all of the Q&A today, just so, which is fine. Thanks everyone for putting your questions in on that side. We probably have time for maybe one of these questions. Again, John asks, which one do I start with? Governance versus PAM versus whichever. I don't know, guys. Do you have an opinion of where you should start? Do you have a starting point? Visibility. Always start with visibility.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, insight is, if you don't understand, which is, I think that's what I've just been pushing probably for the last 5 minutes, right? It's insight. You have to understand what you've got, and if you jump too quickly to governance and kind of compliance, then the world is moving too fast. The cloud environment are changing too fast. You run the risk of really not having an appropriate handle on your tech footprint and what you're using it for and what's in there and where it is and all those things, which means that you're going to struggle to achieve some of your outcomes.
Look, guys, thanks so much for this session. We'll wrap it up here. And again, everyone who had questions, again, maybe we'll get a chance to answer those offline somehow with everybody. Again, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the Access sessions. Have a great day.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Johan.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.